you, and thank you so much for coming out on such a cold day. This is Econ in English, a series that I like to do to talk about important topics in the economy and in economics in plain language. That is the language that you didn't hear when you were taking an intro to econ class, oftentimes. So I'm really grateful to the library in particular. Kathy Parker's here, Emma's here. Stacy Pink and Troy Dobbs have also helped me with this. We've taken a hiatus for a couple of years, but now we're back to be able to do this. So thank you to the libraries for helping us out with this. What we're going to talk about today is Social Security. What the heck is it, and why should I care? And what we're going to do is basically three things. First of all, we'll do a little history. We'll look at the history and the basic structure of the program, what it is, what's covered in it, and then how it's evolved over time. Because what Social Security is today is different than how it started out in 1935. Then we're going to take a look at the bigger picture of how does Social Security as a program fit in with the whole concept of retirement in general. Once we've done that, then I just want to open it up so that we can have a discussion, because I think one of the nice things about a topic like this is that you have questions, and I hope I'll have some answers for you, or at least tell you where you can get some answers if I don't have them. So let's start out with Social Security itself. So Social Security is a program that provides a retirement stipend to people originally when they hit 65. Now that retirement age is gradually going up. By the time I'm 65 in 2025, it'll be 67 when you can get full Social Security benefits. 1935 is an important date because that's when the U.S. enacted it, but it's also important because the U.S. was the last industrialized country to enact a program like this. Germany was the first. They started enacting old age pensions at the national level in the 1870s. Shortly thereafter, Switzerland and a number of the Nordic countries adopted them. Britain adopted it in 1911 and expanded it in the 1920s. France was kind of a latecomer. They came up with it in the 1920s, but the U.S. resisted these kinds of ideas and these programs until the 1930s. The official name for Social Security is, at least in 1935, was Old Age and Survivors Insurance. So the whole idea was to create a plan that would pay out benefits to people who reached a certain age and to those who are widowed. So people who were the survivors either of people who had passed away just from natural causes, and also to, in a sense, give a benefit to those who lost their spouse because of industrial accidents. Those were two of the big crusades of the 1910s and 1920s, was to deal with, in a sense, widows and orphans. So this was a program designed for that purpose. And even though this is a long quote, and I know you can't read it, I put it up here because I want to be able to read it to you. I think it really encapsulates the spirit of the program. When Franklin Roosevelt gave a fireside chat announcing that he was going to introduce this bill, he said that the Social Security program was designed to create security against the hazards and vicissitudes of life. Fear and worry based on unknown danger contribute to social unrest and economic demoralization. If, as our Constitution tells us, our federal government was established, among other things, quote, to promote the general welfare, unquote, it is our plain duty to provide for that security upon which welfare depends. So he was trying to anchor Social Security as something American. It's not foreign. It's not, to hear a word that you might hear during the upcoming political campaign a lot, it's not socialism or something. It's as American as the Constitution. It's to help promote the general welfare. So the original idea was, in 1935, that workers would pay a tax. That money would then be deposited in an account that the Social Security Administration would keep for the worker. And then when they reached a retirement age, they would get a fixed benefit. So there was an association between the individual who was paying the tax and the benefit they would get when they reached old age. Now you notice there's a problem with that. If, for example, you start saving in 1935 for Social Security and may say you retired in 1939, you wouldn't have very much built up. And this quickly became an issue, especially with members of Congress, because their constituents started saying, well, wait a minute, this program didn't even exist when I was 30 years old. I couldn't even contribute to it, and yet I think I deserve something out of this program. Plus, remember, 1935, Great Depression. You have people who are suffering terribly from an economic catastrophe. So, over time, the Social Security Act was amended. And the first set of amendments was in 1939 to create what the program looks like pretty much today, which is known as a pay-as-you-go system. Meaning that even though we pay taxes that have our names on it, so Social Security can actually send us a little thing that says, here's how much you paid. Really the way the system works is we all pay in payroll taxes into a big pot, and then those taxes are used to pay for current retirees. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that maybe our taxes go into some form of a bank account and then they're saved there till it comes back. That's not the way it works. It's pay as you go. And we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. That turns out to be a really important part of the whole story. In 1956, disability was added to the program, so that if you had some kind of physical or mental disability, also included disability created through, say, a work accident, you could earn Social Security benefits. So if you look on your paycheck, you'll often see a line that says OASDI. So remember, I mentioned it was called Old Age and Survivors Insurance. In 1956, a D was added, so it was Old Age, Disability, and Survivors Insurance. So that's what you see on your paycheck. If you're looking for the Social Security tax, a lot of times they'll just write that on there instead of actually writing Social Security. So that came into being in 1956. In 1965, we added a program to pay for hospital insurance and for doctor's visits for people 65 and over. It's come to be called Medicare. And that actually is also a pay-as-you-go system. If you look on your paycheck, you'll see either the OASDI and something else called HI, hospital insurance. That's Medicare. So with every paycheck, the way it works is that since 1965 onward, we pay a Social Security tax and a Medicare tax, and then the revenue is used for the people who are currently receiving those benefits. So it is, at bottom, a transfer program. We don't like to say that, but it is a transfer program from people who are employed to people who are not. So 1965 is when Medicare was added. Now, one program that I think gets short shrift and that we're not going to talk about a lot, but is very important, is in 1972, another program was added called Supplemental Security Income. And the idea here was to take care of people who were adults without children, but who may not be making enough money to make it. Now, if that sounds familiar today, a lot of times people call that a universal basic income. Presidential candidate Andrew Yang actually ran on this as part of his presidential candidacy. Well, we actually have something a lot like a universal basic income that you can apply for under Social Security. The idea is if you meet certain income requirements, certain age requirements, certain family circumstances, you can get a universal basic income through Social Security. But we just don't call it that. We call it SSI. And it was part of the Nixon administration's efforts to reform welfare. They wanted to get rid of certain programs that were done at the state and local level, and what they came up with was a way of consolidating those into a national program. Probably the biggest set of amendments outside of 1939 and 1965, when we had Medicare, was the group that were passed in 1983. These are sometimes known as the Greenspan Commission recommendations for the creation of what today we call the Social Security Trust Fund. Here's the basic issue. I was born in 1960. Many of you were born in the period between 1945 and 1964. We're called baby boomers. There were lots of us, awful lot of people born in that time period. Well, in the 1970s, it became clear to the actuaries of the Social Security system, and pretty much anybody who paid attention to Social Security, that the amount of taxes we were collecting was not going to cover the amount of payments that were going to be needed for baby boomers. It just wasn't going to work. And you basically had two options. One option was, okay, well, we know when the baby boomers are roughly going to retire. Let's keep the taxes basically where they are now. And then when they start to retire, let's just gradually raise the taxes to cover the increased expenses that those baby boomers will incur. Yeah, people didn't like that idea, especially President Reagan. He didn't like the idea of ever saying that we're going to increase taxes in the future on somebody else. You read some of the memoirs of the time, it's very interesting. He did not want to do that. So another idea that Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, actually proposed, some of his advisors had suggested this, was, well, how about we raise taxes now in 1983 and keep them high, basically for the foreseeable future. We're going to have more money than we need to cover the benefits now, but we'll put that money away. We'll save it. We'll create this thing called a trust fund. And we'll basically just put all of that extra money aside into that trust fund. Now, here's the other big argument that President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill had. Where should that money go? Where should it be invested? And they ended up compromising on this as well. They ended up saying, we're going to take all of that money and it's going to be used to purchase United States government bonds. It's not going to go into the stock market. It's not going to go into corporate bonds or anything else. We're going to use that money to buy U.S. corporate bonds, or excuse me, U.S. government bonds. Well, think about that for a second. What that means is, in a sense, you're tying the hands of the federal government and you're saying, here's an absolute promise that they have to pay Social Security. Because if you cash in those bonds to pay for Social Security, where's the money going to come from? All of us. We're the ones that are paying our taxes, which then go on to pay the government debt. So it's a way of guaranteeing that the money will be there. But notice what the downside is. You're not going to get any extra returns from things like a stock market boom. You're going to have a fixed rate of interest on those government bonds set by when they're issued, and that's it. The value of those bonds can't grow, but they also can't shrink. That was the big issue that Tip O'Neill was worried about. He didn't want to have all this invested in the stock market and have the money boom and bust over time. So it's invested in United States government bonds. So let me just show you one picture, but I'll describe it so that you don't need to worry about seeing the picture. If you take a look at this picture here, what it shows is that up to about 2010, that red line, the amount of money that we're paying out in Social Security payments, is actually less than the amount of income that's coming in. So basically, we're taking in more than we're paying out. But starting in about 2010, the amount that we paid out is actually bigger than the amount of money we're taking in every year. But that's okay. That's exactly the way the Social Security amendments of 1983 were designed to work. We knew this was going to happen, so now we can make up the difference by cashing in these bonds. We can just start doing that. But notice what that means, as I said a minute ago. That means that the federal government has to pay those bonds. We have to make sure and either collect enough taxes to pay off the bonds, or we have to roll them over. That is, we have to run budget deficits in order to pay off the Social Security, which then means we have to go out and borrow again to cover that deficit. So either way, we're basically taxing ourselves to pay for this, whether it's through payroll taxes, whether it's through current taxes to pay off the bonds that we're already using, or promising to pay taxes in the future by issuing the bonds. No matter how you slice it, we're going to have taxes to pay for this. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is I like to think of a picture with a big hill on it. We basically ran up a big giant pile of money over the last 30-some years. This blue line in this picture shows that idea that by the time about 2010 came, we had a trust fund that was 4 times as big as what we needed to pay that year's Social Security payments. But what's going to happen over time is that's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and by the time I hit 65, for example, right here, the trust fund's only going to have about half as much money as it needs to pay out that year's Social Security payments. So that's the issue that's on the table now for Social Security policy. If we go back to this picture, somehow we've got to make the amount we spend and the amount of money that's coming in get closer together. And there are lots of options to do this. And it may not sound like it's easy, but it actually is pretty easy economically. Politically, that's a totally different question, but economically, we can either increase the retirement age slightly or increase the Social Security tax slightly. And that'll actually bring the costs and the income together without too much problem. And if we really wanted to deal with it, we could go all the way back to the Social Security Commission, to the Greenspan Commission. We could do another reform like they did. We could look at the demographic projections. We could raise Social Security taxes in a way that would actually build up a fund again. And we could do a little cut with spending or not have it grow as fast, and we could solve our problems for another 40 years. Issue that I'm concerned about is that nobody seems to be doing this. Okay, we're coming into this situation where we're going to have a permanent difference between what we pay out and what we bring in. And in the late 70s, early 80s, we kind of saw this coming and did something about it. Now we seem to be ignoring the fact that that cliff is out there on the horizon. So now I look, instead of the baby boomer people, I look at the students in the audience and I say, well, I'm afraid that's something you guys are going to have to deal with. There's no way around it. Now, let me just point out something about Social Security and its role in retirement. There's a metaphor that we use in retirement. We call it the three-legged stool. And the idea is that if you're planning for your own retirement, there's 3 elements to it. There's the Social Security you're going to get. There's personal savings that you do. And then there's some kind of pension that works through wherever you work, through your company, for example. Well, we've just been talking about Social Security. And one question that I keep getting from students quite often is Social Security going to be around when I'm 65 or 70 or whatever? So another way to say that is that leg of the stool going to be there? And my answer to you is yes, it will be. The question you guys have to deal with is how long is that leg going to be? Right? Do you want it to get really, really short so that you have to rely on the other 2? Or are you willing to increase taxes and deal with the benefits in such a way to keep that 3rd leg of the stool roughly the same as the others? That's up to you. Right now, the way the program is structured is that the leg will stay the same length. It has to. The benefits are given in law, so unless Congress does something, those benefits will not be cut. What will happen, however, is that since the Social Security taxes themselves won't cover all the benefits, and the trust fund will be emptied out, you're going to have to pay regular income taxes towards those Social Security benefits. Congress is going to have to do that. And the only way they can do that is they either have to raise taxes or cut something else. Cut defense spending, cut farm programs. Something else is going to have to get cut in order to find the money to pay for those Social Security benefits. Because they're mandated. They're locked in. Well, if you're worried about Social Security not being there, what can you do about it? Well, let me just tackle a couple of those things and then open up the floor. Here's the rate of personal saving in the United States, and I think this picture gets at it pretty clearly, and I'll just say what I think it says. Back in the 1970s, households were saving about 12 to 13% of their income. And by the time we get to the mid-2000s, they're saving about 2% of their income. So household saving plummets between 1970 and 2005. Now, it's recovered somewhat since then. One of the things that's really interesting is, for example, millennials, if you identify them as a demographic group, have the highest saving rate of people in that age group of any period since World War II. So if you look at, say, a 25-year-old today, 25-year-olds today have higher saving rates than 25-year-olds any time since World War II. So most of this increase is due to that. So that's encouraging. That's a good thing to see. But overall, if you go back to that three-legged stool, the personal savings leg is either short or shaky, depending on how you want to think about the metaphor. How about the pension side? This is the part that really worries me. And let me just go into a couple of little things about pensions. I won't get into too much detail. There are two distinctions that you need to understand in order to understand this bigger debate. First of all, there are benefit plans that are known as defined benefit plans. That means that you are going to get a specific fixed amount of retirement money when you retire. I'll just make up a number, $500 a month. You're going to get that amount month after month forever. So for example, my dad worked for Cargill for 39 years. He had joined them in 1959. He has a defined benefit plan that pays him a certain amount of money every month, month after month, until he passes away. And in fact, it continues to pay it until my mother passes away. That's the way pension plans in the United States commonly worked between the end of the Second World War and the 1970s. Almost every big company, Fortune 500 companies, colleges and universities, you name it, had pension plans that did this. So employees paid in a fixed amount per month, and they were guaranteed a fixed amount when they retired. Starting in the 1970s, however, these pension plans started to go away. And a big reason was it was getting harder and harder for companies to put aside enough money to fund them. This was expensive. And companies, in a lot of ways, asked a pretty simple question, which was, how can we get rid of this liability? This is really expensive. Well, in 1973-74, a series of changes to the tax law were passed. One of them was to create something called the Pension Benefit Security Corporation, which was a government agency that would take care of bankrupt pension funds. Because a lot of companies actually, when they went bankrupt, would tell their retirees, well, your pension's gone. One of the most famous ones was actually in Minneapolis. It was called the Minneapolis Moline Company. They went bankrupt, and their retirees had nothing because the money was saved by the company went bankrupt, retirement money disappeared. Another famous one was Lockheed Corporation, went bankrupt around the same time. So the government stepped in and said, okay, we're going to have something to backstop these company pension plans. But then the question arose, well, how do we shore this system up? Well, the way they decided to do it was, we're going to encourage people to switch from defined benefit plans to what are called defined contribution plans. That is, plans that say you're going to pay in a fixed amount every month, you're going to put that into some kind of financial asset, and then whatever you get out at the end is going to depend on the value of the financial assets. So today these are known primarily as 401k and 403b plans. Those are named for the areas of the Internal Revenue Code. Can never remember whether it's Chapter 401 Section K or Section 401 Subsection K, but I'm not a tax lawyer, so I don't have to know that. But that's where the names come from. 401ks are for for-profit companies, 403bs are for non-profit entities. So for example, like the College of St.Benedict, St. John's University, we have 403b plans. This takes the burden off of companies, because what companies can do is simply contribute a certain amount to an employee's plan, and then that's it. They're done with it. They have no more responsibility for it. The legal responsibility for the 401k or the 403b is now with the employee. It's your plan. And you can put it in whatever investment within certain limits that you want. And if you lose it, you lose it. And if it grows spectacularly, well, great. Good for you. You gained a whole lot. But the company is now out of the picture once they make the contribution. Now, one loophole that they put in here was, you can set up 401ks where the company takes the money and puts it in its own stock. Now, there's been some reforms over the last few years about that, but that's still an option. And that kind of defeats the whole purpose, I think, of the reform, because in a sense then now they're using the 401k funds as a way to run their business. And then if the business goes bust, all of a sudden the value of your 401k goes away too. But that's a whole other talk that we could have. But if you go back to the three-legged stool, the reason why I think understanding Social Security is so important is because personal saving is relatively low today. Pension funds now are primarily defined contribution plans like 401ks, rather than company-based plans that have a defined benefit. That means Social Security is even more important than it's ever been. Because you need to have one leg of that stool, I think, that is solid. That is something you can count on. And so I would argue that one of the pressing issues for the next 5 to 10 years, preferably less than that, would be to shore up Social Security so that it is absolutely 100% guaranteed for the people who are not baby boomers. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and open the floor to questions. So where would you like to start? I've lulled you into silence or stunned you with scary things.
Thanks, Louis. This is great. They say Social Security is the third rail of politics, right? You're not supposed to touch it. You're
not supposed to touch it. That's right.
You get killed. But,
it's also a third leg of the stool. So.
There you go. But it is really a mathematically super easy issue.
It is.
Really, really easy.
It really is.
Politically not so easy. But where does the cap come from? Right now today it's $137,000, I believe.
Right.
And then every dollar we make after that, or someone, I'm not sure the we, but someone makes after that. So, it's 0%. So you don't pay that 6.2%.
Right. So
what's the genesis of that cap? And then if we blow up that cap or increase it, there's oodles of money coming in, right?
Right. So let me just repeat what Matt was saying, because I think this is a really important issue. Right now, the way it works is that roughly 7.5% of all of our income goes into the Social Security Trust Fund up until we make, as you said, $137,500. Now, suppose you make a $137,501 dollar. There's zero tax on that dollar, and no tax on any of them after that. So,
But you don't receive at the end.
and there's the genesis of the cap, which is benefits are also capped. So the question is, could we come up with some way to reform the system that perhaps change the terms of the cap, both in terms of the benefits and the taxes? So for example, I would argue that what we ought to do is eliminate the cap on the tax entirely, which would allow us to reduce the rate dramatically. Like we could reduce the rate to probably 2 or 3%.
Or just make it zero, like first 10,000.
Or some, there's all kinds of options like that, which I think would be really good, because if you think about people deciding whether to work or not, taxes matter. And Social Security kicks in on the very first dollar that you earn.
Yeah.
But as you said, one of the hardest things then is, all right, now where do you cap benefits? How do you actually make an argument that we're gonna have taxes unlimited in terms of the income, but benefits don't? That's always been the hard political nut to crack. I would argue that that at least some political party or some political candidates should make that argument and just be blunt about it and say, look, Social Security has always been about redistributing income. It always has, and we're going to continue to do that, and the way to do it is we have to remove this tax. Now, if you don't like that, vote against it or argue against it, but to me, that is the best way to deal with the funding problem, is to get rid of the cap or maybe extend it out to $500,000 or $1 million or something so that you can lower the rate on the people at the lower end of the income scale. Ideally, it would be nice to exempt, say, the first $10,000 or something like that. My son last summer worked at Target, 30, 40 hours a week for the summer. He was paying Social Security on every dollar, the first one that he earned. Does that really make sense? I don't know if it, from an economic perspective, that it does. It might be better to encourage him to work and use the money to go to school and what have you, and not have that Social Security tax on there. So I think that is the way that if I had a magic wand,
Can
I
I
would
go
fix
follow?
it. Please.
Means testing Social Security, number one, and then, because, Michael Bloomberg, Donald Trump, whatever, they're eligible, they get their Social Security checks.
Mhm.
Doesn't matter how rich you are.
Right.
And then number two would be, of course, we're talking income. Right, income tax, not capital gains. We know Bloomberg
Right.
and others, they don't really have a salary, it's not
Right.
it's not a payroll thing, it's capital gains, so there's another big,
Well, I'll now add a third one on there, which is in Minnesota, we actually tax Social Security
we do,
benefits.
this year, it's gonna be gone.
Right. So the question becomes, I think another way to think about it is, should we continue to fund Social Security through a payroll tax? And I would argue we should. I would argue that we should get rid of it and either go to general tax revenues, or this would be really radical, this would be even more than a third rail, would be to have a value-added tax. Institute a value-added tax in the United States and dedicate it to Social Security and whatever healthcare program we end up doing, because one way or another, we're gonna have something like a public option or Medicare for all or something like that, I think, in the next 50 years. Why not institute a value-added tax now to pay for it, rather than do it at the last minute when the situation is dire? That's, again, that would be even a more powerful magic wand if I could do that. And then you'd eliminate the problem of, oh, do I tax benefits or not? Well, yeah, we're tax everything that's income, and then we send it back out as Social Security, as healthcare payments, whatever. Please.
What is a value-added tax?
So a value-added tax is a tax that's imposed on every stage of production, so that's where the name comes from. So if you're thinking about a glass, you would go to the people who produce the original silica sand. They would pay a tax when they sell the sand. Then the people who turn it into glass would then pay a tax when they create the raw glass, and so on at each stage of production. So they use these in places like Europe, and what's nice about them is they're very steady. They don't fluctuate a lot. They basically bring in a fixed amount of money year after year after year, and they're very easy to administer. You don't need a big bureaucracy to do it. You basically send a bill to the companies every month. And in fact, they build it in as a cost, almost like a utility bill. They just send their money into the government, which is one reason why certain elements of American society have resisted it so much, because it is just so automatic and invisible. It's very hard to protest something like that. Milton Friedman, the famous Nobel Prize winning economist, one of his claims to fame actually is that he invented income tax withholding when he was working at the Treasury Department during the Second World War. And he said that was his biggest regret in life, because it made it so easy to just take money out of people's checks and basically raise revenue for the government. He would have preferred to still have a system like we did before 1943, where you had to pay a bill regularly for it, and you had to come up with the money yourself to pay that bill, because then it would make it more painful to pay your tax.
Well, I do worry, Lewis, about the three-legged stool. I think the Social Security leg is an issue, and I look at, I'm 4 years to retirement if I wanted to retire at the early stage. Personal savings, it's your own money.
Right.
You gotta set it aside. Pensions, they don't have them, and even here with our TIA craft for 403B plan, it's what we choose to put in. It's our money, and pay yourself first. But every one of those legs is shorter. It's a short stool.
It is, and it worries me too, because what's the alternative? Because this actually goes back to something that's a really important transition in American history. So if you think back to before, call it 1850 in the United States, there is no retirement in the United States. People basically retire on the job, is what we call it today. You work somewhere, and then you get older, you get a less stressful job or a less physically demanding job, and the older you get, the less physically demanding the job gets, but you keep on working.
Like our Benedictines. Less stressful, 85 years old.
I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, that's true. Or one of the classic examples is you work at a factory, and when you get into your 50s, okay, you can't work on the line anymore, you become a janitor, or you start cleaning, or you start bringing parts to the line. And then when you get into your 60s, well, you can't do that anymore. Maybe you then become a security guard, or a night watchman, or something like that. And then the older you get after that, then maybe what you're doing is you're working in the company canteen, or you're checking ID badges at the beginning. So you keep on working. You never retire, actually. So that's one way to deal with it. The other way, though, and this is why I brought it up, actually, is your kids take care of you. Right? So, for example,
You know his kid?
He's my advisor. His advisor, my advisor. But, so for example, suppose that you own a farm. You tell the kids, especially the oldest one, okay, the farm is yours, but you have to take care of me until I pass away. That's retirement. That's your retirement security. Okay, well, here's what happens in the United States in the 1830s. Suppose you've got this fantastic farm in Vermont. Wonderful, the best farm in the county. And your oldest son, you say, this can all be yours someday, son. And son looks at you and says, are you out of your mind? I can get on a boat in the Erie Canal and go to Ohio or Indiana or Illinois and buy a farm that's so much better than this. See you later. It's called parent abandonment. It's in all the newspapers starting in the 1830s and 1840s. There are all these old people in Vermont, New Hampshire, upstate New York, Massachusetts, who don't have anybody to take care of them anymore because their kids all go west. And so I'm wondering, this is just speculation, but is this going to be something we transition back towards? If the three-legged stool isn't there, are we going to have to go back to children taking care of their parents? Is there going to have to be some new social contract such that, all right, I'll take care of you when you're old, my kids will take care of me when I'm old, or something like that. What makes me think about this a lot is this whole idea of a sandwich generation. Because you've got people who are taking care of both their kids and their parents. Is this a transition now, where we take care of our kids, and then they take care of theirs, and that's the way the intergenerational contract works? I don't know, I'm speculating, but yeah, I think.
Well, we talked about this, Louis, the other big concern is, and you haven't mentioned it, people live longer.
Yeah.
Yes,
They live longer, it takes more money stretched out over more years.
and that makes you wonder, there's another source of reform. Is it really so bad to increase the retirement age to 70? Probably. I mean, I'm 59.
Depends what age
It's
you're
a
at.
long way to be. But, you know, that's another way to think about it, is to say, all right, demographically, what was 65 in 1935? 70?
Yeah.
75? 80? I mean, I don't actually know. But that should perhaps be part of the reform too. And that's why economic growth won't solve these things, because Social Security benefits go as long as you live. And so even if the economy grows faster, that's not going to generate nearly enough money to take care of people who are living longer. So we've got to deal with either raising the retirement age, cutting the benefits, or slowing their growth, or raising revenue. That's it. There's really no other way to deal with it. You can have variations on all those, but it's those three. Yeah.
Our 401s and 403s, they're all basically invested in the stock market. So there's no guarantee there in bonds.
There's your leg could get sought out money. It could be bonds, but ultimately bonds, stocks, whatever it is you've got invested in, depends on the health of the U.S. economy. So as long as the U.S. economy is healthy, those things are going to be okay. But if you want higher returns, you have to take higher risks. So that's where the problem comes in. If you want to get higher returns, you're going to have to put your money into more risky things. If you put your stuff into more risky things, there's a chance that it'll melt down in something like the 2008 financial crisis. Please.
And with the pensions, that it's basically some kind of a guaranteed insurance plan. So how has that been working when a company goes bankrupt?
Not very well. So the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation that was set up to deal with these has never been adequately funded by Congress. And so people get pennies on the dollar for their pensions. It's been pretty bad. Some of the early ones that worked out because frankly they were just first into the pot, you know, like Minneapolis Moline, Lockheed, trying to think of a couple of others in the 70s. Chrysler Corporation, they actually used that as a little bit in 1979. But overall, it's not worked well at all. If we're going to do true retirement reform, that would be an element just to actually strengthen that thing so that it actually protects those. Make it more like deposit insurance for a bank. Because right now it's not. Because a deposit insurance at the bank says if you have $250,000 in the bank, you get $250,000 back. That's not the way the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation works. It's more like a bankruptcy where you look at what the company's got left and then try to do the best you can for the retirees from the wreckage.
All of this, all three legs of the stool require employment.
They
So
do.
as an economist, how some people are now thinking that in the future, we aren't going to need all those employees.
Right.
And that's one of Andrew Yang's points, right? We should give a guaranteed minimum income partly because people might not have jobs. There might not be jobs for people. Robots will have jobs, but
Right.
people won't. I personally think that's maybe overstated. But all of this falls apart if that happens.
It does, and that's why, well, two reactions to your question. So the first one is, yeah, you're exactly right. It all depends on work. And that's part of the revolution that we've seen in the United States over the last 150 years too, the invention of retirement. The whole idea that you wouldn't just retire on the job. You would actually not earn income is a pretty recent phenomenon. For example, if you look at labor force participation for men over 65, before Social Security, it was up in the 70% range. When Social Security comes along, it just plummets. So here's where a lot of political scientists and economists have argued, well, Social Security is the problem. If you just made it less generous, people would work more, and that would solve it. Now, I think that's kind of backwards. It's not really getting the causation right, but those things do matter. So get to your bigger point. What if work starts to go away? Well, then I think, again, we have to rethink what retirement is and what our social contract is. Do we simply say, yes, we have an obligation to one another and we're going to redistribute income? Or are we going to try to, in a sense, finesse it like we do with Social Security, where we say, well, there's people who are working, there's people who are not working. We're going to transfer money from the workers to the retirees, but then the workers will become retirees and there'll be another generation, and we'll just keep going with that. One phrase that keeps coming up whenever I talk to students about this is Ponzi scheme. Because when you look at it, structurally, it looks like a Ponzi scheme. The thing that makes it different from a Ponzi scheme, though, is that a Ponzi scheme is fraud. You're not telling the people back there, I'm taking the money from here and giving it to them. We're not hiding anything in Social Security. It's a social contract. We are making a promise to do that. But it has the weakness of a Ponzi scheme, which is if you guys don't give anything to the next generation, they're done. They're in trouble. And if you don't have jobs, you're going to start asking, well, why am I going to pay money to these people like Lewis who retired? That doesn't seem fair. I don't have a job. He doesn't have a job. We don't have a job. Why am I giving him money? He should be giving me money. Something like that. Did that get your question? But it brings up that issue, which is, all right, should maybe we have a universal basic income that's a floor for everybody? But that then asks the question, where do you get the money for that?
So do you think it's very likely that in the future there won't be enough work for tons of people?
No, see, that's where I try to take the argument seriously, but I just don't believe that the computers and the robots are going to take our jobs. I just don't, the evidence doesn't convince me. Put it in economic terms, I think that a lot of this stuff means that technology is actually going to complement people rather than substitute for them. I think that it's really going to be much more about that than it is about taking our jobs away. So I'm actually not as worried as Andrew Yang is. In fact, I'm not worried at all. But maybe, again, that's because I'm 59 and I'm not worried.
Well, there's also, in the past, not that even that long ago, tons of people didn't work for pay. I mean, when most people were farmers, and you lived on your family farm, and you produced food for yourself and some extra to sell.
That's right.
So that you could buy the things you couldn't produce yourself. Half of the population or more was not really, I mean, they really weren't. They lived in the rural areas and they grew.
That's right.
So,
and in a sense, that's what the whole thing about the invention of retirement was, to take something that was a non-market transaction. I'm going to take care of my parents. So there's no market involved. There's no, you don't pay me to do that. We don't sign a contract or anything. And turn it into a market transaction. Because the other part of the invention of retirement is, all right, go back to the farmer in Vermont. His son or her son leaves. What are they supposed to do? Well, what they start to do is they start to do personal saving. The amount of personal saving in the United States starts to jump. Really, it just rises really, really fast. They start buying insurance policies, and insurance companies start to grow. They start putting money in banks. Before this, banks are mostly used just for transactions. Now it starts to be a place where you park your money for the future. You start to see the market for bonds and stocks start to grow because you've got money looking for a place to sit. There's all this resources available. And so this is when non-market transactions become market transactions. And in a sense, we're seeing that over the last 50 years too because of women coming into the labor force. right? They were providing and still provide huge amounts of unpaid market labor for retirement. Now we're gonna probably have to pay for it, right? I can't just assume that there's gonna be a woman in my life, either a sister or a mother or a daughter or whatever, who's gonna take care of me. I'm gonna have to pay for that care. It was always costing society something. Now we actually have to put a dollar value on it. Mark?
Going back to the job market, something that I've always been told, like ever since high school, is that there are new jobs being created in general as well. So the scare of like automated jobs and stuff like that, there's always going to be people that need to take care of said robots, engineers, that kind of thing. But there's also jobs like social media liaisons in a lot of companies. That position really wasn't there maybe even 10 years ago, but a lot of these jobs are being added to the labor force, and that
Exactly.
kind of.
That's actually though where I think Andrew Yang's idea about, and people who write about universal basic income have something that's really important, which is, as a society, I think we're gonna be fine. That doesn't mean individuals aren't gonna be hurt, right? If you're someone who learned a particular trade or skill, like I'm a college professor, and now all of a sudden my job goes away, well, my kids will probably be fine, but what am I gonna do? How am I gonna deal with it? Or back in the late 70s when I graduated from high school in 79, I was told, learn to be a data entry operator. Those jobs will always be around. Well, they're not, they're gone. Okay, well, what if I had listened to that advice, become a data entry operator, and now my job is gone? I might be in a really bad spot. To me, that's where we really need to put a lot of attention is there are people who are not gonna be able to make that transition either because of age, because of lack of access to new training, to inability to move because maybe there's family connections or whatever. At the individual level, there's going to be a lot of pain, I think. But at the societal level, we're going to be all right.
I remember in high school, they were telling us that, we think that these jobs, robots will be coming along. They didn't even really think about computers that much yet. And, they're thinking that there's only gonna be 20 hours a week, 20 hours of work a week for people. You better start thinking about, what you're gonna do with your time, because you can have all this extra time. Back then, people were working 40 hours, and now people seem to be working more than 40 hours.
Yes.
And my wife's grandpa, he lived to be 110.
Oh my gosh, what?
And I remember him talking, he was well over 100, and he said, that he was amazed, with all the progress we've seen in technology and the speed of being able to do things and machines helping, that, he thought that at some point we should be running out of jobs. And he says it never happened in his lifetime. So unless something new comes along, I don't know.
Well, you guys are talking about, you're at the one end of it and we're at the other end, and it's interesting to see.
Jobs too, because
Yes.
the baby boomers, a lot of them went into healthcare. They were told to go into healthcare. That's what they're doing. Now they're getting to the age where they're retiring, but we don't have enough people going into those healthcare professions at the same rate. So it's going to be the type of jobs that we're able to fill, or that how we're trained, or that type of thing.
And that gets into some really interesting sociological issues because I did a project with Catholic Charities and the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe to look at economic development around Mille Lacs. And one of the things that the people who at Catholic Charities did was they were doing a survey about job attitudes and things. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over again was men responding by saying, I'm not doing those women's jobs. I'm not going into healthcare. I'm not going to do, I can't even think what some of the examples were, but there was that barrier there. It's like, I don't do that. Well, you're going to have. It's kind of my message. You're going to have to do that. There's just no way around it. Or not have a job.
I have a question about you said millennials are saving money at a greater rate than they were at some point. Is that because they're actually moving back in with the baby boomer parents and they were saving their money where the
That
parents
is-
were spending
It
their money?
actually is, that is what it
So
is.
where does that put, I'm trying to form my question here in terms of, where does that put those baby boomers financially? Is it that they had more that they could give, where the millennials don't have that legacy money, or they're?
Well, from what I've been reading, it's that's part of it, but the other thing is that, if you look, according to studies that I was just looking at this afternoon from the New York Fed, if you look at people around age 25, they are less likely to buy a house and they're less likely to buy a car. And it isn't because they can't afford it. They look at it as a bad investment.
Yeah.
And so they are putting their money into things that end up becoming retirement savings. They're maxing out their 401ks, they're putting money into personal savings, and then some of them do live at home, but then they actually contribute to the household budget. They aren't just sucking down the resources of mom and dad, they actually are contributing to the household, which is really helpful if you've got, this is the issue we were talking about a few minutes ago, if you've got, for example, someone who's 55 or 60 who loses their job because of technological unemployment, but their son or daughter moves back in with them, they continue to work, and you could make the whole thing run.
Who's made the health insurance?
That's a whole other talk.
No, that's the age, you're right, 26.
That's exactly it.
26, right? That's the age.
Exactly. Well, it's 6 o'clock, so this has been wonderful. Thank you very much.